Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a scenario that has completely flipped international security and the global economy upside down. The incredibly complex 2026 military and economic crisis between the United States and Iran. We're going to systematically break down exactly what happened when the world's most critical maritime waterway became the center of an intense, high-stakes geopolitical standoff. To understand why this conflict commands the entire world's attention, you really just need to know one number: 25%. Before the war broke out in February 2026, a staggering 25% of the entire world's seaborne oil trade, plus 20% of global liquefied natural gas, passed through the Strait of Hormuz. We're talking about the absolute lifeblood of the global energy market squeezing through one single narrow choke point. When this waterway is threatened, the ripple effects are felt instantly in every global market, at every gas pump, and across every supply chain. I want to establish right out of the gate that the stakes here literally could not be higher. To break down a crisis of this massive scale, here is our roadmap. Number 1, the dual naval blockade. Number 2, the escalating maritime clashes out on the water. And number 3, the fragile diplomatic mediation attempting to resolve the deadlock. I promise you a completely impartial, fact-based breakdown of the military realities, the economic impact, and the ongoing diplomatic efforts. Let's get right into it with Section 1, the dual naval blockade. This represents the core geographical and economic nightmare that gripped the region following the initial outbreak of the war in late February 2026. And this brilliantly illustrates the unprecedented dynamic that developed by mid-April. We didn't just have one blockade to deal with. We were dealing with two overlapping, competing blockades. On one side, heavily enforced by the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, Washington's strategy was to shut down Iranian ports, actively preventing commercial ships from getting to Iran. On the flip side, you have the Iranian blockade. In retaliation, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps completely restricted normal navigation through the Strait of Hormuz, laying sea mines and issuing warnings that passage was forbidden. So you've got Washington aggressively closing off Iran and Tehran aggressively closing off the Gulf. The result? A total, devastating economic deadlock. The economic strain of this dual blockade was absolutely massive, particularly for Iran. By early May, the U.S. Department of Defense estimated that Iran had lost a staggering $4.8 billion in oil revenue directly due to the U.S. blockade. In fact, President Donald Trump claimed the naval blockade was costing Iran up to $500 million every single day. This was a deliberate strategy designed by the administration to apply maximum economic pressure. But, of course, a closed strait also meant that global energy markets were losing access to vital transit routes, creating immense operational strain and anxiety worldwide. And this immense strain is really testing domestic politics too. Hardline factions in Tehran are absolutely insisting no concessions be made without guaranteed relief, while over in the U.S., the administration is facing intense scrutiny over rising energy costs, and lawmakers on Capitol Hill are heavily debating war powers and the long-term timeline of this entire engagement. With all those immense economic pressures mounting on both sides, the situation on the water became incredibly volatile. That brings us to Section 2, escalating maritime clashes. Let's look at the direct military actions and the chaotic realities of this conflict. Let's move to and see how this builds across our timeline, because honestly, the pace of escalation was dizzying. On February 28th, the strait was effectively blocked by Iran as the conflict ignited. We saw a brief glimmer of hope on April 8th with a temporary ceasefire agreed upon during the Islamabad talks. Unfortunately, that completely failed. Just days later, on April 13th, the U.S. officially initiated its naval blockade of Iran. Fast forward through a couple of months of intense pressure, and on June 17th, the Islamabad Memorandum was signed between President Trump and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian to end the blockades. But the relief was incredibly short-lived. By July 8th, the truce had entirely broken down following multiple Iranian strikes on commercial ships. It was just a relentless, exhausting cycle of failed truces and rapid military escalations throughout the spring and summer. The physical toll of this military escalation was highly destructive. Based directly on briefings from U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth and General Dan Kane, the U.S. military hit over 2,000 Iranian targets. In the process, they destroyed over 20 Iranian naval vessels and successfully neutralized a submarine. According to the Pentagon's assessment, these strikes effectively neutralized Iran's major naval presence in the theater. It was a massive projection of military force aimed at degrading operational capabilities all along the strait and right up into the Arabian Gulf. Out on the water, the daily reality was absolute chaos. We saw the USS Abraham Lincoln strike group positioned to provide intense offshore pressure, though the U.S. Navy is actually deploying the USS George Washington to relieve it right now amid these prolonged operations. U.S. Central Command reported intercepting and redirecting dozens of vessels, and U.S. forces actively disabled commercial ships attempting to breach their blockade. This included firing missiles at the Curacao-flagged Belma and disabling the Mozambique-flagged Levine tanker. Simultaneously, Iran struck multiple commercial and LNG vessels, including Saudi and Qatari flagships, really asserting their operational management over the waterway. Regional tensions spiked even further when the UAE officially accused Iranian forces of targeting commercial tankers. Between the two powers, the strait basically became a heavily contested active combat zone where commercial shipping was routinely intercepted, rerouted, or physically attacked. With military action resulting in a devastating and costly stalemate for global trade, the focus urgently had to shift to the negotiating table. Let's move to our final section, fragile diplomatic mediation, where we examine the intense, multi-party shuttle diplomacy trying to solve this puzzle. So the crucial point is that the core disagreements paralyzing these negotiations are absolute. The Trump administration's demands are clear and steadfast. They want global energy corridors completely open, with zero transit tolls or interference with commercial navigation. The primary objective is keeping oil flowing and pushing prices down. And this is all happening even as reports surface of heightened security protocols for President Trump during regional travel due to potential missile threats. But Iranian demands are fundamentally at odds with this objective. Tehran insists that before normal navigation can resume, the U.S. must lift its naval blockade, grant sweeping economic sanctions relief, and provide compensation for wartime damages. They require guaranteed economic security before giving up their geographic leverage. To try and bridge this massive gap, the international community has relied heavily on intense shuttle diplomacy. Third-party mediators, specifically Oman, Pakistan, Qatar, and Egypt, have been working tirelessly on interim frameworks. Their immediate goal isn't to solve the whole war, but just to ease maritime restrictions and establish safe transit corridors. However, even this mediation is incredibly tense. For example, President Trump explicitly warned Oman that they would face aggressive U.S. sanctions, or in his words, we'll have to blow them up, if they facilitated any sort of Iranian transit fee system. The mediators are walking a highly dangerous diplomatic tightrope right now. Now, what's really interesting about this is how perfectly it captures the delicate nature of the situation. Qatar's Prime Minister, Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani, recently stated, "We are closer than we have been, and we are not there." Both sides have taken decisions in recent days that were not easy. This primary source quote illustrates the agonizingly close state of the current draft text. It shows that despite all the public rhetoric and the ongoing military friction, behind closed doors, extremely painful concessions are actually being weighed. The proposed interim mediation mechanism they are trying to finalize is actually highly pragmatic. It breaks down into these 3 steps. First, the strait reopens for safe navigation. Second, ships actually resume moving through the corridor. And third, all the bitter disputes over fees, sanctions, and administration are deferred to a joint technical committee. As the Qatari Prime Minister explained, the accepted principle is that the ships move and the arguments continue at a table, rather than out at sea. It's a strategy that prioritizes immediate global maritime security while kicking the absolute most difficult political disagreements slightly down the road. Which leaves us with this final provocative question to ponder. Can temporary diplomatic frameworks hold the global energy market together in a region defined by volatile deadlocks? As we've seen throughout this explainer, the military posturing and economic stakes involving the United States and Iran are absolutely monumental. While mediators push for a fragile peace at the negotiating table, the reality on the water remains a very tense standoff. Understanding this dynamic is key to understanding the future of international energy security. Thank you for joining me, and definitely keep this question in mind as we watch how this critical geopolitical crisis unfolds.